It's quite interesting. And one of other your articles, your father told you that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Can you elaborate that story as well?
Yeah, my father had a lot of good expressions, and that to me just underscores the importance of really trying to implement, really trying to put into action your ideas. And I oftentimes use that when I get toward the end of a course, and I'll say, many of you are going to be tempted to go back to your busy life as a lawyer or a different practitioner of something else. And you're going to take this binder of all of these lessons that you've learned this week, all the notes you've taken, and you're going to put that binder up on the shelf in your office. And you're going to say, whenever I need to access something important to be a better mediator, I know right where that information is. But guess what? On your shelf, it's never going to be put to use. What you need to do is figure out a strategy for implementing that knowledge. And I give them a strategy for implementing that knowledge. And I say just what my father said, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And that's not to fault those who are well-intended. It's simply to say that what distinguishes those who are well-intended from those that are accomplished is really putting the grease and the elbow into motion.
So the implementation is that important thing.
Absolutely it is, yeah. And that doesn't mean you always have to be right. It just means you always have to be trying and learning from your mistakes.
As you mentioned, learning by mistake, can you tell us anything we can learn from your mistake? One of your, started with worst though, and with best cases and in mediation?
You know, it's hard because my memory gets so flooded with so many different experiences. We could spend a lot of time just sharing stories and trying to learn from them. My best experiences are clearly those where I'm able to make deep connections with people and bring them some resolution. And I'll give you an example of that since you asked. Years ago, I mediated a case involving a child, a very young infant, who was on a changing table getting her diaper changed. And the mother looked away for a moment, and the infant grabbed a bottle of baby oil, and the cap was off the baby oil. The child ingested the baby oil. The oil coated the interior of her lungs, and she asphyxiated. She couldn't breathe, and she died. And of course, the family was as distraught as one could only imagine, having lost a child to that kind of senseless event. And they sued the manufacturer of the baby oil product. And we went through 2 days of very emotional mediation. And while the dollars we raised should have been enough to satisfy the family, they were too emotionally distraught to let go. And I understood it as best one can, not having gone through that experience. And so we continued the conversation with her lawyer. We tried to brainstorm ways to creatively add value to this settlement in some way that would bring comfort to this family. And what we decided was that we would make as a condition of settlement that the company would have to redesign the caps on these bottles to be child-proof. And so that became part of the settlement. And also then what became part of the settlement was these people were not only free to talk about the settlement, because in many instances in the United States, when people reach agreements, particularly in cases of that notoriety, there's confidentiality agreements that prevent them from talking far and wide about the company or what happened. But instead of that, the company said, no, you're free to go talk. And they went on a major TV show in the United States called the Oprah Winfrey Talk Show. And they talked to other parents about this event that had tragically changed their life. And in the process, other companies saw what was happening, and they too decided to change their caps and put child-resistant caps on some of their products, their baby products. And so quite literally, this family changed an industry. And so those kinds of moments where you really not just bring about change in people's lives, but really help them get through despair and suffering and get on in a productive way, those are the moments that really stand out for me. There are times where there are failures, both sort of procedural failures where I might bring people together in the room at the wrong time and it puts people further behind in sort of their conversation. Those are moment-to-moment judgment calls, and those are mistakes. There are some tragic kinds of moments in mediation that still haunt me, even though I'd look back and it wasn't really something that was done wrong. I had a case one year where I came in on the eve of trial and negotiated for 3 days over the weekend, continued the negotiation into the Monday morning when the parties were scheduled to start their trial. We agreed on a settlement. They went into the courtroom and put the settlement terms on the record so it could become an enforceable settlement. And a week later, the woman, the wife, called of the plaintiff to tell me that her husband had committed suicide and that his involvement in that litigation for 5 years had dug himself such a deep hole of despair he couldn't get out of it. She was still appreciative of my efforts in mediation and still wanted to thank me, but she was distraught. And so those kinds of things where I wish, gee, if only maybe I'd gotten to that dispute years earlier, maybe I could have made a more profound difference in this family's life and not seen them so far down that road. So those are the kinds of things that I think about as I try and learn from case to case and mediation to mediation.
Wow, a lot of stories. You need to write a book. The first story is quite interesting in baby oil cap. That kind of similar thing happens when the company is being sued by punitive damage. Thereafter, they change some kind of whole industry pattern. But that was made by one mediation. That was quite surprising.
Yeah. So we can have a profound impact, not just on people's lives in the moment, but on stakeholders sometimes that aren't even present in the room.
Yes, amazing story. And you have handled more than thousands of cases. Can you tell us one of the multicultural experience?
So I have a number of multicultural experiences. One year I was mediating a claim between the US government and a contractor in Kabul, Afghanistan. This was during the time that the American military was entrenched in Afghanistan, and part of the things we would do would be hire local contractors to build outposts and things. And this was a general contractor or prime contractor who had not been sufficiently paid pursuant to a government contract. And after about 7 or 8 hours of relatively non-productive negotiation, I remember asking the gentleman, this was a Zoom mediation long before the pandemic, so it was really unique in that sense that we were including this gentleman from his home in Kabul as we were negotiating into the middle of the night, our time. And I said to him, sir, I have this impression that we're not making progress, in part because that's your cultural approach to negotiation, that maybe you just need to wear everybody down before you're prepared to make concessions. And if that's true, that's okay. But I'm curious if that's what we're up against here, because we seemingly haven't made progress all day long, and I'm curious why. He said, Mr. Edwards, you have me wrong. You may be right about my culture. I can't speak for my culture, but I can speak for myself. And what you need to know is that in Kabul, if I do not pay my subcontractors to whom I owe money for having worked on this project, they will kidnap my family members or worse and hold them for ransom until they're paid. So I don't have the luxury of compromising with your government until I get the money that I need to satisfy these people who did the work. I said, thank you very much. That's an important lesson for me to keep in mind. But over the years, I've mediated with American Indians. I think when I talk to people about culture, I'm not just talking about ethnic or religious cultures. I mentioned that I grew up about 30 miles south of where I live now in Silicon Valley. And corporate cultures are very much a unique entity unto themselves. When I'm dealing with a startup culture or a technology culture out of Silicon Valley, that's a very different culture to deal with than dealing with a Fortune 500 manufacturer in the Midwestern United States, a Ford Motor Company or a John Deere tractor or any number of other large, well-established corporations. So don't overlook culture in its many different permutations.
I see. Normally we see high context culture and low context, and comparing Asian and Western culture. In some cases, Asians get used to obey to the authorities rather than insisting their own opinion and speak up to the people. But nowadays it's quite different. But in all days, based on my experience, one thing I need to learn was obey to the authority. Don't speak up. When you speak up, something bad things are gonna happen. Especially in Korea, we are technically in the middle of war. below a certain age need to go to mandatory military service. And they learn to obey in the military service, because in the army you need to obey to the authority. And so thereafter, that experience makes them obey to the authority, especially within the company, within the society, and obey to the higher authority. And normally it's by age. And age is quite important factor. But in the Western society, it's quite different. And so, was there any difficulties dealing with Asian peoples or high context culture?
Yeah, it's a great question, DK, because on the West Coast of the United States, we have a lot of interaction with Asian and Pacific cultures. And you want to be careful, or I want to be careful about stereotyping or generalizing, and where that deviates from individualism. I teach bias, both overt bias or prejudice and implicit bias, which is a whole different conversation. But in my teaching, one of the chapters, Malcolm Gladwell is a very interesting American author who's very thought-provoking, and one of his chapters talks about just what you've described, which is high context, low context communication and cultures. Interestingly, one of his stories that he tells is the example of an airline crash from a Korean airline, where the pilot and co-pilot had this hierarchical relationship. And the co-pilot, as they were approaching this landing, instead of saying to the pilot, direct confrontational, we're off course, he said something like, this doesn't look like the same approach we were on last year at this time, or words that were not deemed to be challenging. And that those were all conversations that were gleaned from the cockpit recorder from the crash site after the airplane had crashed. And as a result of that, Korean Airline and other Asian airlines brought in communication consultants to help change the culture of communication within the cockpit. And you're right in your conversation now, DK, that a newer generation of people are sort of challenging some of those historical relationships and generalization. But where on that continuum people fall in a particular mediation is where it's important for us as mediators to recognize people as individuals, yes, against a background of a culture, but being careful not to stereotype, being careful to really understand who that person is in the moment that makes them unique, with their culture being an important consideration.
I see. And while mediating those kind of different culture cases, I think you have a big aha moments. And can you share any big aha moments?
I had a lot of big aha moments. I'm not sure a lot have occurred around culture, although with the exception of that example I just gave you a few moments ago. I think one of the big aha moments in mediation, frankly, occurred in the very early days of mediation for me. Because when I began this mediation process, I was like you, a lawyer, like you, a litigator, but my expertise that was then only developing was in an area of product liability law, represented pharmaceutical companies and automobile manufacturers. And when we started this concept of mediation and this idea of bringing people together, one of the very first entities that we sold on mediation to try it as an experiment was an insurance company that insured real estate agents and brokers in real estate transactions. Frankly, an area of law I knew nothing about. And so I said, sure. I mean, it was the first client we had. Let's try it. Let's try mediating failed real estate disputes. And we would bring people together, buyers and sellers and brokers who, for whatever reason, had real estate transactions fall through. And as you know, oftentimes those are very acrimonious and emotional because these are the biggest investments in people's lives in many instances, and ones that are near and dear to their heart because it often impacts their home and where they live and raise their children. And so I found myself in these mediations of just a couple at first, but increasingly more and more over that first year or two. And a couple things presented this aha moment. First of all, I was young. I was in my early 30s. So I had no gravitas professionally. I had no experience in real estate law other than what I had learned for the bar exam, 5 or 6 years earlier, which was precious little. And I realized, though, in succeeding to resolve those disputes, in the first instance, that I could resolve those disputes, that success came about despite my limitations. And the aha moment was, Bruce, you're onto something here. Set your ego aside. It's not you. It's the process, it's the process, it's the process. And properly managed, That process in a variety of settings, implemented appropriately with lots of listening and connection and empathy and understanding and opportunity for exploring creative solutions, the process itself works given enough time and effort. And that to me was the biggest aha moment in my mediation career that really gave me the confidence to move forward and know that I could mediate not just disputes of all kinds, but disputes of all sizes, complexity, because when the process is properly overlaid to these disputes, there's so much more they have in common than they have differences. And that's what really allows us to be successful as mediators, knowing to and how and when to manage that process. So to me, that was the biggest aha moment.
Wow, it's quite interesting because on last interview with Jeremy, he mentioned that Anglo-Saxon mediation is getting to yes style, purpose-driven, and settlement is their purpose. But French mediation is more like process-driven, as few tax will, and whether mediator have gone through all the four processes, then that's successful. The definition of success is different from Anglo-Saxon, and if they have gone through the process, then that's successful mediation. Even if there's no settlement, if the process has been entirely followed well, then that's success of mediation. And it seems like your story is in line with those French style mediation.
So it's hard to generalize about the United States on any axis, right? We're 350 million strong, and as you can see, quite polarized in a variety of different ways. Probably the mediation profession reflects that to some degree too. There are those that come from a background of being a judge, and their mental model, as we discussed earlier, is about bringing the parties to a resolution and getting a deal done. And that forms their framework for discussion. When I teach mediation, one of the techniques I use to help people think about their mental model is to envision the satisfaction triangle. In other words, looking at a triangle as three equal parts as a measure of success. One is what you describe and what we've just talked about, outcome satisfaction or outcome success. Was a deal achieved? But there's still two other sides to the triangle. One of those is process satisfaction. Again, what I just discussed. Has the process been delivered and managed in a fair way? And the third side of the triangle is personal or psychological satisfaction. Have my needs been met? Did I connect with this person? Have they listened to me? Is there a degree of empathy involved? Studies have shown that if you can reach two out of those three sides of the triangle and achieve success, parties will come back to mediation, both in that case and in other matters. And so I teach that for a lot of reasons, not the least of which it takes some of the pressure off those mediators who feel that they're going to be measured exclusively by one metric. Is a deal done? And so in the United States, there's a mix of folks that understand that and those that are solely focused on getting a deal done. And one of the reasons that I'm so enthusiastic about implementing mediation in different countries, in different cultures, because I have this unique opportunity, I feel, to help teach people an appropriate way, although I realize that's a bit self-serving, but an appropriate way of thinking about mediation and approaching it, because there'll be plenty of time down the road for people to get enthusiastic about just getting a deal done. I want them to think more holistically about what else they can accomplish in this mediation process.
I see. So settlement and process and psychology, right?
Indeed.
So if 2/3 of that is satisfied, then it's successful mediation based on your definition of success.
It is. And what's interesting about that viewpoint, DK, guess what? Two of the sides of that triangle you actually have control over as the mediator. The process satisfaction and the psychological satisfaction. You don't have control over outcome satisfaction because you can't force people, nor should you, to accept a deal.
I see. So can you provide any example? Non-settlement, but you satisfy both in psychology part and process part. You're fully satisfied, and part is satisfied with them, but non-settlement.
It happens all the time. In other words, you could walk into my office and you might see 50 binders or folders of ongoing disputes that I'm working on. And they're ongoing because people have bought into the process. They're satisfied with the way the process is going. Psychologically, they're getting what they need as they move through it. They just haven't yet reached an agreement. And so we continue with the mediation discussions. Maybe it's a situation where they need more information. Maybe it's a situation where psychologically they're just not ready to let go and say yes to a settlement. And so we bring them back a month later and continue the conversation, ultimately trying to achieve that third leg of the triangle, that level of outcome satisfaction. But many a case starts out with you as the mediator gaining people's process satisfaction and psychological satisfaction, but requiring more time to get to an outcome satisfaction result.
I see. So you have experienced minor failure, but for me, it looks like you are quite successful from business-wise and everything, mediation, jams. But was there any failure you have ever suffered, either professionally, personally, and it turns out very positive result?
You know, we all have sort of failures in our life. I'm not going to suggest I'm any different than you or other people. Most of my failures, fortunately, have been just professional decisions about how we structured something in the company, or didn't learn quick enough how to manage an opportunity. They're just sort of speed bumps on the professional pathway, and we try and learn from them as you do with any of life's failures. I'm not somebody that says, gee, this company I was running went bankrupt and I learned the following from that for the next company I started. I don't, for better or worse, my career trajectory is somewhat bland. It's somewhat of a straight upward curve without lots of ups and downs, peaks and valleys. So from that standpoint, I would say this. Early on, fortunately not too many. Most of the people that I've trained and invested resources in are very thankful, appreciative, and have given back to me in a variety of ways. I guess some of my disappointments are those people who have taken from me. I don't mean like physical stuff or even money necessarily, but taken the opportunity and not necessarily been appreciative of that opportunity and gone out sort of with their own sense of purpose and ego and maybe priorities that differ from mine. But you know what? That's a small price to pay for the majority of people that I think I more positively influence and really are appreciative and understanding of the jewel that they're given, the gift they're given in terms of knowledge and experience that I have to share.
I see. You meet new people every day. It seems like you did mediation every day means you meet new people every day. And while meeting those kind of many people, there might be some misunderstanding of preconception of some people. And was there any understanding you have ever had?
So one has to be careful, because when you mediate every day, you can get fatigued. You can get compassion fatigue, or you can get prone to mental shortcuts and not do the job as it needs to be done. We know from teaching that one of the dangerous mental shortcuts is called implicit bias. This idea that our mind forms judgments at a subconscious level about people, particularly, without rising to the level of conscious awareness or thoughts. And there's lots of studies and examples that support that in life. One of the tragedies in my life about 10 years ago is that my younger sister passed away unexpectedly from an obesity-related disease. And I realized over time in my mediations that people who presented that were out of shape and particularly obese, that I was reacting to them in a way that maybe wasn't giving them every benefit of the doubt about who they were in a genuine way, that I wasn't spending the time appropriately that I would spend with other people to get to know them and connect with them for whatever bias I might have. But it caused me to stop and think about that. And there were certainly some mediations I look back on and said, in hindsight, I didn't give that person the same degree of attention and respect and authenticity that they deserved to really flesh out who they were as a person, so that my decisions about interactions and ultimately suggestions weren't founded on an appropriate level of data points reflecting that person. They were based more on who I thought that person was. And I regret that, but it's a lesson that I've learned.
So get rid of implicit bias, right?
Yes.
And one of previous interview with Sonong Lung, he's executive director of Singapore Mediation Center. He's a part-time actor And he mentioned acting is quite positive impact to the mediation, because when you act, you need to do the same thing every night for maybe 20 days. And so every night he need to get refreshed. Otherwise, it's gonna stick to the same things every day. So you said that implicit bias is quite bad for meeting someone. And so in order to avoid that, and those kind of training, every day, every mediation, getting to wearing new mask and then refresh their start, I think that would be quite important advice.
Well, I also think that I agree with your former guest that we do need to refresh ourselves every day, because at the beginning of the next day, you are meeting new people. They have every right to deserve the same degree of attention and effort that the people did the day before and the day before that. The question is, how do you do that as a mediator? And there's a whole new conversation amongst mediators who've been doing this for 10 or 20 or 30 years. And that's around the issue of self-care and self-compassion, and what is an appropriate level of practice before you risk hurting yourself, if not people you're trying to work with. And meditative practices, exercise, healthy eating, all of those things come into the conversation. But your former guest was right on point. You do need to refresh yourself. As far as the mask of an actor, I'll tell you one of the most interesting lessons from the last 3 years in this COVID environment and learning what's possible to mediate remotely is now every day literally looking at yourself on screen and seeing how I look and how I come across with a raised eyebrow or a furrowed brow or a expression on my face that's not exactly what I was trying to communicate. All of that is now so much more immediate in terms of reflection of who you are, quite literally, because we're on screen so much of the day.
Yes, exactly. Jeremy told me that the compassion and empathy is different, and different part of brain is activated when we see in the feeling of compassion and empathy. And when we empathize, and our emotion is with the other parties and feel the same feeling. But in compassion, he described that in his terms of compassion is, I want you become better, and I want the dispute settled. I want both party being well. And those kind of things are different. It does not generate fatigue like empathy. Empathy generates a lot of fatigues, but compassion, the positive side of compassion, is not generate fatigue and just wish them well. So he mentioned it's different. Do you agree with that, Paul?
Well, to some degree, I defer to Jeremy. He's a student of neuroscience and really reads a lot. I do find that mediating with compassion, mediating with empathy, and just mediating generally is an exhausting process, partly because as empaths, as most mediators are, we take on a certain level of emotion and a certain level of conflict just to be able to manage it and navigate with it. The question is, how do you get close to that third rail without touching it and really finding yourself really influenced by it? And that's the challenge that we all face, not unlike psychotherapists or others who have to figure out how to erect walls between themselves and patients. We all have to learn to do the same thing. I have a background educationally in psychology. I don't have any classical training. I just know that being in the moment, focusing my attention, looking to connect with people, listening with empathy, with curiosity, listening for what's not being said is an exhausting process. Time flies by, and people will say, gee, I just did a partnership dispute of a law firm last Monday. It was a 12-hour mediation. I think I took a break to eat a small snack of nuts and to drink and a couple bathroom breaks, but otherwise it was nonstop. And I got to the end of that 12-hour process and I just took a deep breath, and all of a sudden the exhaustion started to wash over me, but I didn't feel it in the moment as I was going. I was so absorbed in what was in front of me and the need to continue multiple conversations at a variety of levels that it's just all consuming. And that's, to me, what's so exciting about the process, in part because it does require that level of attention, commitment, and perseverance to be effective in many instances. And when you don't have that to give on any given day, you shouldn't walk through the door, because as I've said already, people deserve everything that you can bring to the table.
Wow, it's being in the moment, right?
Yes, indeed.
I see. On your articles or in the classes, you quote a lot of good maxim or advices. If you choose one best advice, in either it's maxim or advice from your father, what would that be?
I'll give you two that come to mind, DK. One has to do with the value of patience and perseverance, which at the end of the day is so important in our mediation world. And it was a 19th century poet in the United States who wrote, "Long after the final no, there lies a yes. And on that yes, the future world depends." And it's that sense that you'll be told no time and again, and you need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. But ultimately, you can persevere. And when you do, the stakes are high. So stick with it. The other quote that comes to mind, as I said, I grew up in the shadow of Silicon Valley as it was forming in the 1960s and 70s. And so I'm a big fan of Steve Jobs, and I've read a lot of Steve Jobs' autobiography and books about him. One of my favorite quotes about Steve Jobs is, "We're here to make a dent in the universe. Otherwise, why even be here?" And to me, that's such a great quote because it's so gargantuan. It's just so expansive in its trajectory of thinking that we could somehow make a dent in the universe as an individual. Yet it's eye-opening that when you think about it in the context of his life, what a dent he made in the universe. And while most of us will never achieve what Steve Jobs has achieved, it doesn't mean that we can't make our own dent in our own way. And I like that quote, and I like to share it with people who go through courses with me because I want to encourage and expand people's thinking because we are limited to a large degree by what we think is possible. And so we need to begin by expanding our imagination with regard to what's possible, and particularly in an environment like mediation that's so new and developing and opportunistic in terms of how it can be applied. And frankly, in a world where we so desperately need those skills, that I want to encourage people to think as broadly as possible. There are some projects I'm working on I can't share with people now because they're so sensitive in terms of geopolitical conversations. But one of the things I can share is we now have about 300 mediators from Ukraine signed up for our next course. And we're going to begin to try and train mediators to help be prepared for a post-war Ukraine as 8 million refugees or some portion of those folks return home and need to be brought back into civilized Ukraine society and all the disputes that will follow in that melding of immigrants. And as one example of thinking big and one example of people, no matter how small you started, being able to influence things in the world. So dare to dream big.
Wow, you are one of the biggest dent in the mediation universe.
Trying to.
Yeah. And do you have role model? If you have, can you describe?
That's a good question. People ask me that sometimes about role models in the mediation. And frankly, and unfortunately, because when I started, nobody was really mediating that I knew of. There are people out there that I certainly look up to in the mediation world. Bill Urey at Harvard, obviously, is a pioneer and one who takes these lessons to a broader plane. I've been a big fan of people who promote peace in our world. Certainly, Martin Luther King in our country was a huge proponent of peace, and not just a proponent of peace, but people that encourage us to give to others. And one of Martin Luther King's quotes, because you've now got me thinking about things that I have written and like to say, life's most urgent question, according to Dr. Martin Luther King, is what have you done for others recently? And so I think about those kinds of role models as people that are using their lives to effectuate change and help other people's lives. And so there are lots of folks that fall under that category for me. And those are the people that I admire, people that could easily be satisfied with where they are in life or what they have, or just, and not that there's anything wrong with spending time with friends and family, but people that go beyond that and continue with their passion and continue to give to others as best they're able to improve others' lives. Those are people that I idealize.
All guests are actually my role model. And just casual question: if you have any habits or routine that most improve your life? Can you recommend one of them?
They range from the mundane and benign. I do exercise a lot because I need to be fresh in my daily mediation practice. I take my dog on long walks because it's meditative. And as we've now learned, just being out in nature both reduces your blood pressure and helps create positive thoughts in your mind. So those are things, simple things that I do. But I also do things in the mediation world where I'm an ardent preparer of mediation. So if people send me things, I read and I organize and I synthesize and I develop so that I can be a quick study in a dispute. And really, I had somebody just last week. He was in a private breakout session, and I came back and I said, I've been down the hall for an hour and a half with this couple who paid several $1 million to have their home built. And I want to tell you what I've heard. And I proceeded for 10 minutes to basically make their opening argument or their lawyer's opening argument at trial. And he sat back, he said, Bruce, that's the best concise recitation of someone's position I think I've ever heard. I'm glad they don't have you as a lawyer. And I said, thank you. But it starts with me being prepared both before the process, listening carefully to what people say, and then injecting the legitimate, authentic emotion that comes in their message and being able to repeat that back in some way that's authentic and meaningful, if not ultimately persuasive. And that's what I do, but it takes a lot of time and preparation. So to your answer, DK, I take what I do seriously and I prepare for it, knowing that every day is a real blessing to be invited into somebody's life at a difficult moment. And I have this unique opportunity to add value, and I better not squander it.
I see. That's where your passion comes from.
It is.
Another casual question. If we can read only one book rest of your life, what it could be other than religious one?
There are so many books I've read over my life. I remember being forced to read War and Peace when I was in college. And at the time, it was the hardest thing to plow through it. But over the years, thinking back on it and reflecting on the individual suffering, at the time, I wasn't a student of conflict. I certainly wasn't a student of conflict resolution. But what I carried with me 50 years later are just some of the stories of individual people who suffered because of this broader conflict. And I've often thought back on that and say, wow, there are so few people in the world that have the opportunity and the ability to impact people's lives in the way that are impacted by world leaders. Why can't some of us in the mediation community find a way to bring dispute resolution lessons to those people? And so here we are, 50 some years later, having read that book, and the world is at war. Russia is still at war again, and 8 million people left Ukraine as a result of the conflict barely a year old. And yet, what if better dispute resolution techniques were available to some of the world leaders to have avoided that conflict? What a difference it would have made in so many people's lives in the ultimate sense as well. And so if you talk about a book, there's a book that just resonates with the impact of armed conflict and the absence of peace in the world, and a lesson that we should always pay attention to.
I see. Tolstoy's one, right?
Yes, it was Tolstoy. Very good.
My last question, I already take your time too much. And if you can take time machine and meet 30-year-old you, what advice would you give to yourself?
Slow down, enjoy the journey, and think big. Dare to think big.
Slow down, enjoy the journey, think big.
Yeah.
If you heard that advice when you were 30, then what would have changed from now?
As you can tell, I work hard. And certainly the tension between what my wife describes as me having professional ADHD, meaning it's hard for me to slow down, versus what I have learned from reading books like books on self-care and self-compassion and things you look back on and wish you had done, things outside of the four walls of the mediation environment. I mean, I've tried to travel, I've tried to be open to learning new things. We've learned from a Harvard researcher just this past week that the key to happiness is preserving, maintaining social relationships. And while I've tried to do a good job of that over the years, one could always do better. And so when I say slow down, enjoy the journey, surround yourself with good friends, do enjoy the successes and failures that come with the process. But that's, I think, the lesson I would impart to a 30-year-old.
More satisfaction.
Indeed. Nothing wrong with enjoying life as we go.
I see. Any last word to the audience?
Well, I've enjoyed the conversation immensely and would appreciate the opportunity to stay connected and engaged. And it's such a small world these days in many respects. Our ability to connect through an evening or morning through Zoom and get to know each other and realize that while we have cultural differences, personal differences, and the like, there's so much more that connects us than divides us in humanity. And so I would just ask people to stay focused on those similarities and those connections as we look for better ways to improve our human condition. You know, when you step back from all that we have to talk about, and I talk in terms of implementing mediation across boundaries, across cultures, and across continents, and across countries, and the things that are the stressors in our world looking ahead, be they environmental stressors or pandemics or economic disparity or a variety of other things that make its way into the daily news, armed conflicts. We need to come together in ways to creatively think about how to resolve those problems that don't stop at our doorsteps, that don't stop at our cultural boundaries or our country's boundaries. And I would just encourage people to think that way and begin to think with a broader vision. But that's the lesson I think I would leave people with tonight.
I see. I admire your great passion and great being at the moment. Thank you so much, Bruce, for the long time interview.
It's been my true pleasure, and thank you for the opportunity. And again, I look forward to staying connected.
Yeah, staying connected.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Welcome to the 7th episode of World Mediation Deacons. This is DK. I'm extremely excited to have my guest today. His name is Harban Singh. Malaysia is the most globalized Islamic country, Wall Street of Islamic finance, Mecca of halal industry, the only Asian country which overcame Asian financial crisis without IMF's support. Harban is one of the most experienced mediator, arbitrator, adjudicator in Malaysia and in AIAC. AIAC is the Asian International Arbitration Center, independent, non-profit, non-governmental international area provider. They built resolution service from Islamic arbitration, mediation, and adjudication. Sat Sri Akal.
Thank you. Sat Sri Akal to you also. Yeah. So I'm honored to be invited, although I don't recognize myself as a deacon. But I've been involved in this dispute resolution for 30 years or so. So in that sense, maybe what I do is I always try to share my experiences